All right, everybody. So let's continue talking about the function of the chords that we can use in various keys. We got ourselves moving in a really nice direction, and we sort of figured out how we can use circle of fifths relationships to, assign functions, and we saw the real power of the 2-5-1 progression, and then we talked about how the 3 chord and the 6 chord sort of live a bit outside of that functional pull of the 2-5-1 area. But by the time we got to the 3 chord, we were saying that our progression was getting kind of long, right? And then we realized that we hadn't even discussed what to do with the 4 chord and the 7 chord. And that really added a lot of issues, because if the 3 chord felt far away from 1, 4 and 7 were even farther. So let's talk a bit about what we can do with that. So let's take a look at some music here and see if we can figure something out. Okay. So basically, this is what I was just saying. If we just could continually go out from 1, 1's our goal. If we go out from 1 using fifths, we said we had 3 here. So that would take us a bunch of chords. Let's say we're going to be in F major on this thing here. So if we're in F major, 3 chord, if we went from 3 to 6 to 2 to 5, it takes a bunch of chords to get there. And then adding 4 and 7 on the ends, you can do it, obviously, but it's sort of a very long progression, and especially if instead of doing it like I just did, where I pretty much just played 1 beat per chord, let's say we had a measure per chord starting on 4. So here's F. If I was going to do, this is going to take forever, right? We're sort of not really moving at as much of a forward-looking pace as the whole idea of progression would suggest. So we want to sort of see if we can find another place for 4 and 7 rather than on the front end of a long string of chords. So let's sort of start here. Let's start by talking about the 7 chord, because this gives us a really good window into how we can think about this. And the reason I say that, so here we are in F major, right? This is F. So our 7 chord here is E, G, B flat. So let me just write those notes. I know it's stacked here nice and neatly, but it never hurts to just get a little more practice spelling out these chords. So we got E, G, B flat. Now, the presence of one of these notes in particular should be a really, really good clue for us as to how we might be able to repurpose the 7 chord. So instead of having 7 live way out here in the outer orbits of the solar system and lead to 3, we actually can use 7 in a bit more of a significant fashion. And if we look at that, we've talked a lot about the 7 chord, actually, for a chord that we haven't used too much. Which of those 3 notes do we actually have a special name for in the key of F major? Well, it's E. We've given E kind of a special name because it's the leading tone, right? Oops, not the leading tone, the leading tone, right? So we know that E is a very important note in the key of F major because it leads to F. E leads to F, and we saw that all the way back just in talking about major scales. But it's become more and more important in our harmonic conception. So if E contains the leading tone, we can think of what other chord in our progression or in our key contains the leading tone that we could sort of match 7 up with. So what other chord really prominently contains the leading tone? Well, it's 5. The dominant chord contains the leading tone. So let's sort of think here. Let's think about what in F major, what is the 5 chord? The 5 chord in F major is a C, E, G chord. I'm going to write it backwards so that I make sure C is on the bottom, right? So C, E, G. So if I start to just sort of jot some notes down, I got C as the root. We just mentioned that E is the leading tone, so that's going to be in there. But then you start to notice something else too. What else is common between 7 and 5? Well, G is common as well. And so that means that the 5 chord and the 7 chord contain 2 common tones. These are all right. The 5, the 7, and the 5 chord contain 2 common tones. And so what that means, and I would say particularly because one of the common tones is the leading tone, what that means is these 2 chords have a similar identity and they have a similar purpose, so we can use them functionally in the same way. So if we sort of think about F major, we talk all about that 5 chord because we can hear that the 5 chord wants to resolve to 1 really prominently, right? Sorry. Well, here's the deal though. We could say the same thing about the 7 chord. I played it in inversion there, but if I did it like this, you could hear that 7 wants to resolve to 1 just like 5 does. And so we are going to connect these 2 chords because of their common tone relationship. They both want to lead to 1. And so 7, we're going to say that these are both types of dominant harmony. They both have dominant function because of those common tones, right? And so once we figure out what to do with the 4 chord, we'll go back to the PowerPoint and we'll sort of see where that's going to leave it in the progression, but you should start to have a pretty good idea. So this common tone idea is pretty important. So if we come down here, I'm going to move this over here so that it's not in the way. When we come down here to think about the 4 chord, we could also use that same thinking to figure out how to match it up, because the 4 chord we can say has B flat D F, and so let's sort of think, what other chord does it kind of look like? What chords does it share some common tones with? Well, if we took D and F, because that's what we had up here. Well, no, never mind. I was wrong about that. But if we took the top 2 notes, just as a thought experiment, and said, okay, what other chord has D and F? I could say, well, I'll use D as the root, and I might end up with a D, F, A chord, right? And I could say, well, those 2 things have 2 common tones, so that's pretty good. But if we then said, okay, well, what Roman numeral would go with D, F, A in the key of F major? And remember, this is easy. You can just count up. F, G, A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so we would say that, okay, if that was the case, this D, F, A chord is 6. So would it do us much good to have another 6 chord? Does 6 have a strong function in a key? No. Remember, 6 is kind of, it's kind of in the middle. But it's not as strong as the 3 functional relationships at the end. So let's say, okay, maybe not that. Let's instead take the first 2, B flat and D, and see if we can relate those to anything else. So if we say, okay, I got D, I got B flat, what would the root be? If D is the 5th, B flat is the 3rd, the root would be G. Is G an important Roman numeral in F major? What would G be in F? Well, it would be 2. And 2 is certainly much stronger than 6 was. What function would we give 2? Well, I write our notes down here. Well, we call 2 a predominant chord, right? So these are both predominant chords because they share those common tones. And again, It's about they both have B flat and D, so they both have those two notes. The 2 chord is G, B flat, D, and we've talked a lot about how that chord, the 2 chord, really wants to go to 5 because it's a predominant chord going to dominant, which wants to go to tonic. But if I just change this, instead of it being a minor 2 chord to a 4 chord, hear how it wants to go to 5 just as much because it's got the same 2 notes in it. It's got those common tones. And so 2 and 4, because of these common tones, are both going to be our predominant chords. So like I said, we could have sort of said, well, 4 also shares 2 common tones with 6, but in thinking about function, only predominant, dominant, and tonic have really strong functional identities. Everything else, 3 and 6, were sort of in a little bit of no man's land or no woman's land, no person's land. So 4 and 7, they were even more in the outer limits. And so when we go to connect them to function, we want to try to get them in a predominant and dominant area. And we found through common tones that 7 can easily be understood as a dominant chord because it has 2 common tones with 5, and 4 can easily be heard as a predominant chord because it has 2 common tones with 2. So let's sort of take a look and just, put that into a really a nice visually clear element. So here was what we were doing. This is just a quick little recap here of what we said. We talked about how in the circle of fifths, these are very far away. But if we can find a way to think about their function, which is what we just did, think about what functional attributes they have, we find them in a very different position. So instead of being so early in the progression, 4 and 7 can now find their place as predominant and dominant harmony. And this gives us a really interesting sort of harmonic chart here where the vast majority of the chords are loaded up in these really functionally important roles: predominant, dominant, tonic. And that's just really, really, really critical. Before we unpack that in just a tiny bit more, remember that this arrow here is signifying that the 1 chord goes anywhere. The 1 chord wants to lead everywhere. It's the 1 chord is the center of our key here. So everybody else kind of wants to keep moving towards the 1 chord. And remember, that's because what we're describing is functional harmony, which is about going somewhere, is about a place to go. In harmony that's oriented around a place to be, we don't think of it in quite the same manner. It's not all about moving towards tonic in one way or another. But in this model, it is. We want to make sure we're moving towards tonic, moving towards the 1 chord. And so that's why predominant and dominant harmonies are so important, because they affect that motion the most clearly. So the 1 chord can go anywhere, right? So the 1 could just hop right back to dominant, which would take it right back to 1, right? That's a very logical progression, just from 1, 5, 1. Or now we know 1, 7, 1. Easy peasy, right? We could go from 1 to 2, right? Here's a 2 chord, 2, 5, 1. Or we could go way back. 1 could move all the way to 3, which then could go to 6, which now we know could go to 4, could go to 5, 1, and get a much more fleshed out progression. But the key is that it's always moving towards the goal one way or another. So let's unpack, though, because now we've got 2 chords that are a predominant and 2 chords that are a dominant chord, and that bears some discussion. And so this is where it's kind of important the way that we write it here, which is to say, you'll notice that when it was all in a line, there was only 1 chord on each function. 2 goes to, or 6 goes to 2, 2 goes to 5, 5 goes to 1. No questions asked. But now we have 2 predominant chords, 2 chords in the same place. Same thing goes with dominant. And the thing that's important is the way we write it in this chart helps us to see where the important relationships are. And so what we do is we write 4 and 7 on the top of this little area here, and we keep 2 and 5 on the bottom, because 2 and 5 are the foundation of predominant and dominant harmony. And so if we wanted to have a progression, for instance, where we used both a 4 chord and a 2 chord, we would say we should use the 4 chord first and the 2 chord second, because 2 is stronger in that it'll move, let's say, to 5. And so what would happen is we would get that circle of fifths relationship if we get 2 going to 5 and then, let's say, 5 going to 1. So if we wanted to have both a 4 chord and a 2 chord, we would go to the 4 chord first, so that then from the 2 chord, we would have the circle of fifths motion to 5, and then circle of fifths motion from 5 to 1, right? So that's sort of the way we notate this. We put the slightly weaker predominant and dominant chords on top and keep the structurally critical 2 and 5 chords on the bottom. And you can hear that while, let's say, 5 and 7, they have the same function, but 5 is very, very strong, whereas 7 tends to be a little weaker. Weaker doesn't mean bad. That's important. That's an important thing to point out. Sometimes weak motion or weak progression is what you want, because you don't want it to sound like the end, right? Strong often signifies finality, the end. So having a weaker harmonic progression, let's say from 4 to 7 to 1, that's so much less strong than 2, 5, 1. That might be exactly what we want, because you can sort of keep things going longer if it's not quite as strong and final. So don't interpret weak to mean bad and strong to mean good. It just means if we do want to have a strong progression available to us, we would want to rely on the circle of fifths relationships that are still intact. So if we're going from 3 to 6 is a fifth, 6 to 2 is a fifth, 2 to 5 is a fifth, 5 to 1 is a fifth. So that linear fifths-based relationship is still here, but we have options that can weaken our progression, which may be exactly what we need. So that's how we get 4 and 7 into our progression without them being exiled at the very, very, very distant beginning of the progression. 4 is a really effective predominant chord, and 7 is a great dominant chord, and that's because they have 2 common tones with 2 and 5. And we particularly found that 7 was so clear to see because one of the common tones is the leading tone, which is such a critical note in the 5 chord. So that's how we integrate 4 and 7 into our functional harmonic progression. Next, we're going to talk about some extra exception type things that we add to this chart that just give us a really well-rounded, full progression.